This presentation covers what exactly is natural selection and evolution based on natural selection. Natural selection is a process by which populations change in response to their environment. As individuals better adapted to the environment leave more offspring using genetic variations already in the population. As the environment slowly changes over tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, any individuals with slight variations that may favor the new environment, getting drier, getting moister, whatever the change is, will leave more offspring. And then evolution is the change in the genetic makeup of a population or species over time, usually vast amounts of times, tens of thousands of years or millions of years. Natural selection and evolution depend on sexual reproduction within populations, which leads to natural variations. So let's be clear. A group of animals, say like these ducks floating along in a pond, do not get together, have a conference, and decide that they will now eat a different kind of food because their usual food supply is, for whatever reason, in short supply. It's just that a few of them might by chance have the ability to eat another source of food, small insects instead of pond weeds or something, and therefore they can survive a little bit better in this changing environment. If the environmental conditions that reduce their original food supply continues, then this subpopulation of ducks with that trait that allows them to better utilize a different food source will likely, over many generations, produce more offspring, pass that particular trait on generation after generation. Then slowly, over hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of years, that trait may predominate in that population, and the original trait might have disappeared. Bottom line is, species do not choose to change. They either have the ability in response to a changing environment, or they perish. It's a bit like playing cards with friends. If you're playing a game of poker and nothing initially is wild, your hand has 2 8s in it, might be the best hand, 5-card draw at that table. But then someone calls 4s were wild. Well, the environment at that table has now changed, and now someone with 2 4s and a queen has a better hand than you do. The cards dealt were a bit like the luck of the draw of genetic variation individuals receive from their parents. Whatever variations you may have or may not have advantageous in that environment, you can't change your hand. It's what you're dealt. Natural selection depends on 5 main parts. All species have genetic variation. Humans, ducks, deer, cougars, they all have a little bit different variation. The environment presents many different challenges to individual survival. Organisms tend to produce more offspring than their environment can support. It's just the way it is. Thus, individuals of a species must compete with each other for survival, the struggle to survive. Which are best adapted? What traits do they have to better survive than their cohorts? Individuals that are better able to cope with the challenges of their environment tend to leave more offspring than those less suited, survival of the fittest. And the characteristics of the individuals best suited to a particular environment tend to increase over time, slowly increase over long periods of time. Speciation is the process by which new species are formed. Natural selection, speciation requires divergent evolution, the accumulation of differences between species. For example, large and smallmouth bass, very similar fish, yet mouths are a little different, their shading is a little different. Subspecies of two populations of the same species. So what you have here is an example of, at one end of the Grand Canyon there's a species of ground squirrel, and then as you move along from one rim to the other, the south to the north rim, on each side of the Grand Canyon they're separated. These squirrels can't jump across that vast cavern, so they're separated, and the environment on each side is a little bit different. And over the hundreds of miles that you travel along the Grand Canyon, these ground squirrels don't travel very far in their lifetimes. So little by little the population changed. And when you get back to the other rim, where they actually come back together, the north rim and south rim squirrels are so different that they do not interbreed, and that's the definition of a species. A species can produce, breed and produce viable offspring. Viable means the offspring can have offspring. So when these two squirrels come together, they're so different that they are two separate species, and that's what speciation, to create a new species, is an example due to natural selection. Why don't they evolve back, as it says? Or how is it maintained? Well, a lot of times, like I just said, it starts by geographic isolation, separated by land or sea. There's oceans. In case of some small insects, like an ant, maybe just a river would separate you. Land, a mountain range, deserts, something that's insurpassable. Ecological isolation, separated by niches. If you only eat acorns, you probably aren't going to hang around with another species that only eats pears, because they grow in different areas, and you can't survive on pears, so you wouldn't hang out with them. So there would be no intermingling of genetic material because you don't hang out together. Temporal isolation, separated by reproductive timing. This is a great example of this is in Wisconsin, when our ponds are being, in the spring, frequented by many different species of frogs. Some of those species of frogs might actually be able to genetically interbreed, but because certain frogs only breed when the water is very cold, and then later on, that would be like the tree frogs and the peepers, spring peepers. Later on, the leopard frogs and bullfrogs only reproduce in those same ponds where the water is much warmer. So it's water temperature, but it's actually timing. Temporal means timing. That they will not be in the same pond at the same time because of water temperature. Behavioral isolation, separated by reproductive behavior or choices. Mallards and wood ducks possibly could interbreed if you say force them, but genetically it'd be possible. But a female mallard is never going to breed with a male wood duck because they look too different. Their behavior, their mating rituals don't jive, so they won't interbreed. Mechanical isolation, just physically unable to reproduce, kind of like jokingly saying a Great Dane and a Chihuahua probably have physically a hard time. And then reproductive isolation due to genetically unable to reproduce. You've drifted genetically so far apart that even if they were able to physically reproduce, the genetic material is too different to form a viable offspring. Example here would be maybe like a horse and a donkey. A horse and a donkey can get together and produce a mule, but the mule's sterile, so that still makes the horse and the donkey separate species because they cannot produce viable, meaning offspring that can reproduce themselves. And since this is usually a bone of contention between the pro and con environmentalists, evolutionists, as far as we go, let's just say it again. The idea of evolution has never, ever, ever proposed that man evolved from apes. It's always a thing that is used as an argument, and it just has never been said. So it's kind of crazy to argue about something that was never a part of evolution. Human evolution, we may have shared a common ancestor tens of millions, hundreds of million years ago, but we did not evolve from apes. There's just a couple of examples of some of the anthropological evidence that people have dug up of different subspecies and species of humans, some of which have become extinct, like Homo sapien Neanderthals. The Neanderthals became extinct, and we evolved upward to a higher levels. The brain got bigger until we reached, as it shows here, the ultimate soccer player.